shark in this water. We have to get back to the boat before we get eaten. Freaking rip! Frank, you're my man. Drowned at the beach. Wrong, the story develops. Hey, Joseph, you want to have a pool party? Okay, dude, let's do it. Do you like to eat? Are you like to come here? Oh, no. Hey, Daddy, I'm so horny. You're lying. Can't touch your baby. You're growing boys over here.
Centuries after her political unification, terror geared up for war. Most thinkers and fantasists of previous times had imagined interplanetary war as a glorious, fast-paced spectacle of massive spaceships, one-man fighters, and last-minute heroics. No fantasy could have been further from the truth. War between planets was a slow, nerve-wracking series of precisely timed decisions that spelled destruction on biblical scales. Most of the time, the combatants never saw each other. Most of the time, the combatants were not there at all. War became a duel between complicated, autonomous machines, programmed to maximize damage to the other side while trying to last a little longer. Such a conflict caused horrendous destruction on both sides. Phobos, one of Mars's moons, was shattered and rained down as meteorite hail. Earth received a polar impact that killed 1/3 of its population. Barely escaping extinction, the peoples of Earth and Mars made peace and reforged a united solar system. It had cost them more than 8 billion souls. Star people. The survivors agreed that massive changes were necessary to ensure that such a war never occurred. These reforms were so comprehensive that they entailed not political, economical, but biological changes as well. One of the greatest differences between the people of the two planets was that over time they had almost become different species. It was believed that the solar system could never completely unify until this discrepancy was overcome. The answer was a new human subspecies, equally and better adapted not only to Earth and Mars, but to the conditions of most newly terraformed environments as well. Furthermore, these beings were envisioned with larger brains and heightened talents, making them greater than the sum of their predecessors. Normally, it would be hard to convince any population to make a choice between mandatory sterilization and parenting a newfangled race of superior beings. However, memories of the war were still painfully fresh, and it was easier to implement these radical procedures in the wake of such slaughter. Any resistance to the birth of the new species did not extend beyond meager complaints and trivial strikes. In only a few generations, the new race began to prove its worth. Organized as a single state and aided by the technological developments of the war, they rapidly terraformed and colonized Venus, the asteroids, and the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Soon, however, even the domain of Sol grew too small. The new people who inherited it wanted to go further, to new worlds under distant stars. They were to become the Star People. Colonization and the mechanical oedipus faster-than-light travel and hyperspace emerged as the only solutions. Simply put, it was impossible to take a large number of people with enough supplies to even the closest star to make colonization feasible. The existing technologies could only slug along at mere percentages of light speed, making the journey an epoch-spanning affair. Enormous generation ships were conceived and even built, but these succumbed to technical difficulties or onboard anarchy after a few cycles. The solution was to first go there and make the colonists later. To this end, fast and small automated ships were sent forth to the stars. On board were semi-sentient machines programmed to replicate and terraform the destination and construct its inhabitants from the genetic materials stored on board. A bizarre problem plagued such attempts. The first generations of humans to be manufactured sometimes developed a strange affection for the machines that made them. They rejected their own kind and perished after the massive identity crisis that followed. This technological Oedipus complex was not uncommon. Nearly half of all the colony-founding attempts were lost through it. Even then, however, the remaining half was enough to fill humanity's own spiral arm of the galaxy. The Summer of Man. Right after mankind's colonization of the galaxy came its first true golden age. Reared by machine prophets, the survivors of the Oedipal plagues built civilizations that equaled and even surpassed their solar forebears. This diffusion across the heavens did not mean a loss of unity. Across the skies, steady flows of electromagnetic communication linked mankind's worlds with such efficiency that there was no colony that did not know about the goings-on of her distant siblings. The free flow of information meant, among other things, a vastly accelerated pace of technological growth. What couldn't be figured out in one world was helped out by another, and any new developments were quickly made known to all in a realm that spans centuries of light. Not surprisingly, living standards rose to previously unimaginable levels. While this did not exactly mean a galactic utopia, it was safe to say that the people of the colonized galaxy lived lives in which labor, both menial and mental, was purely compulsory. Thanks to the richness of the heavens and the toil of machines, each person had access to material and cultural wealth greater than that of some nations today. During all this development, a curious phenomenon was observed. While alien life was abundant in the stars, no one had encountered any signs of true intelligence. Some attributed this to an overall rarity, while others went as far as divine influence, resurrecting religion. Regardless of the theorizing, one question went truly and utterly unanswered. What would really happen if mankind ever ran into his equals or superiors in space? An early warning. During those times, a small discovery of immense implications warned humanity that it might not be alone. On a newly colonized world, engineers had stumbled across the remains of a puzzling creature, considered so because it had every hallmark of terrestrial animals on an alien planet. Justifiably named Pandaravis pandora, the colossal fossil belonged to a bird-like creature with enormous claws. Later research determined it to be a highly derived therizinosaur from a lineage of herbivorous dinosaurs that died out millions of years ago on Earth. While every other large land animal on that colony world had 3 limbs, a copper-based skeletal system, and hydrostatically operated muscles, Pandaravis was a typical terrestrial vertebrate with calcium-rich bones and 4 extremities. Finding it there was as unlikely as finding an alien creature in Earth's own strata. For some, it was irrefutable proof of divine creation. The religious resurgence, fueled at first by mankind's apparent loneliness in the heavens, got even more intensified. Others saw it differently. Pandaravis had shown shown humans that entities powerful enough to visit Earth, take animals from there and adapt them to an alien world, were at large in the galaxy. Considering the time gulf of the fossil itself, the mysterious beings were millennia older than humanity were when they were capable of such things. The warning was clear. There was no telling what would happen if mankind suddenly ran into this civilization. A benevolent contact was obviously preferred and even expected, but it paid to be prepared. Silently, humanity once again began to build and stockpile weapons, this time of an interplanetary potency. There were terrible devices, capable of novaing stars and wrecking entire solar systems. Sadly, even these preparations would prove to be ineffectual in time. Q. The first contact was bound to happen. The galaxy, let alone the universe, was simply too big for just a singular species to develop intelligence in. Any delay in contact only meant a heightening of the eventual culture shock. In humanity's case, this culture shock meant the complete extinction of mankind as it had come to be known. Almost 1 billion years old, the alien species known as Q were galactic nomads, traveling from one spiral arm to another in epoch-spanning migrations. During their travels, they constantly improved and changed themselves until they became masters of genetic and nanotechnological manipulation. With this ability to control the material world, they assumed a religious, self-imposed mission to remake the universe as they saw fit. Powerful as gods, Q saw themselves as the divine harbingers of the future. This dogma was rooted in what had been a benevolent attempt to protect the race from its own power. However, blind, unquestioning obedience had made monsters of the Q. To them, humanity, with all of its relative glories, was nothing more than a transmutable subject. In less than 1,000 years, every human world was destroyed, depopulated, or even worse, changed. Despite the fervent rearmament, the colonies could achieve nothing against its billion-year-old foes, save for a few flashes of ephemeral resistance. Humanity, once the ruler of the stars, was now extinct. However, humans were not. Man extinguished. The worlds of humanity, gardens of terraformed paradise, seemed strangely empty to the Q. Often there were no raw materials available other than people, their cities, and a few big ecology populated by genetically modified animals and plants from Earth. This was because humans had erased the original alien ecologies in the first place. Offended by another race trying to remake the universe, the Q set forth to punish these infidels by using them as the building materials of their vision. While this led to a complete extinguishment of human sentience, it also saved the species by preserving its genetic heritage in a myriad of strange new forms. Populated by ersatz humans, now in every guise from wild animals to pets to genetically modified tools, Q reigned supreme for 40 million years on the worlds of our galaxy. They erected kilometer-high monuments and changed the surfaces of entire worlds, apparently to whim. One day they departed as they had come, for theirs was a never-ending quest, and they would not, could not stop until they had swept through the entire cosmos.
Hey, are you friendly?
1,000 worlds, each filled with
Hello?
creatures and ecologies that had once
Are you friendly?
most of them perished. Others lasted a little longer to succumb to long-term instabilities. On a precious few worlds, people eventually managed to survive. In them lay the fate of the species, now divided and differentiated beyond recognition.
I don't want any trouble!
Their world lay under a scorching sun, its intensity made monstrous through the interventions of the bygone Q. The surface lay littered with husks of dead cities, baking endlessly like shattered statues in a derelict hot oven. Yet life remained on this unforgiving place. Forests of crystalline plants blanketed the surface, recycling oxygen for the animal life that teemed underground. One such species, barely longer than the arms of their ancestors, was the sole surviving vertebrate. Furthermore, it was that planet's last heir of the star people. Distorted beyond recognition by genetic modification, they looked for all the world like pale, overgrown worms. Tiny, feeble feet and hands modified for digging were all that betrayed their noble heritage. Aside from these organs, all was simplified for the life underground. Their eyes were pinpricks, they lacked teeth, external ears, and the better half of their nervous system. The lives of these ersatz people did not extend beyond digging aimlessly. If they encountered food, they devoured it. If they encountered others of their kind, they sometimes devoured them too. But mostly they mated and multiplied, and managed to preserve a single shred of their humanity in their genes. In time, it would do them good. Titans. On the endless savanna of a long-extinguished colonial outpost, enormous beasts roamed supreme. More than 40 meters long by terrestrial measurements, these behemoths were actually the transmuted offspring of the star people. Several features betrayed their human ancestry. They still retained stubby thumbs on their elephantine front feet, now useless for any sort of precise manipulation except for uprooting trees. They compensated this loss by developing their lower lip into a muscular, trunk-like organ that echoed the elements of Earth's past. As bestial as they seemed, the Titans were among the smartest of the reduced sub-men that remained in the galaxy. Their hulking stance allowed for a developed brain and, gradually, sentience re-emerged. With their lipped trunks, they fashioned ornate wood carvings, erected hangar-like dwellings, and even began a form of primitive agriculture. With settled life came the inevitable flood of language and literature. Myths and legends of the bygone, half-remembered past were told in booming voices across the vast plains. It was easy to see that within a few 100,000 years, humanity could start again with these titanic primitives. Sadly, as a catastrophic ice age took over the Titans' homeworld, the gentle giants disappeared, never to return. Predators and prey. Devolved predators were common among humanity's feral worlds. Most of the time they resembled the vampires, werewolves, and goblins of bygone lore, hunting equally subhuman prey with a combination of derived weaponry. Some had enormous heads with large off-world colonies. In addition to paw-like hands with switchblade thumbs, they also had gaping, tooth-studded prey lapsed into complete animosity. The hunters managed to keep the spark of intelligence alive in their evolutionary honing. Mantelopes. Not all devolved people lapsed into complete bestiality. Some held on to their minds, while losing all of their physiological advantages to the genetic meddling of the cube. A singular species was a prime exemplar. They were bred as singers and memory retainers, acting much like living recorders during the reign of the cube. When their masters left, they barely survived,
Hey,
reverting
princess.
to a quadrupedal stance and occupying a niche as grazing herd animals. This change was so abrupt that the newly evolved mantelopes endured only due to the forgiving sterility of their artificial biosphere. The mantelopes, equipped with full, if slightly numbed, human minds, and complete
Calm down, doggy.
lived agonizing lives. They could see and understand the world around them,
What?
but due to their bodies, they could do nothing to change it. For centuries, mournful herds roamed the plains, singing songs of
I love you
disarray
too.
and loss. Entire religions and oral traditions were woven around this crippling racial disability, as dramatic and detailed as any on bygone Earth. Fortunately, the selective forces of evolution made their agony a short-lived one. Simply put, a brain was not advantageous to develop if it could not be put into good use. A dim-witted, half-minded mantelope grew up faster than a smart one, and grazed just as efficiently. The mantelope's animal children overtook them in less than 100,000 years, and their melancholic world fell silent for good. Nothing was sacred in the evolutionary process. Swimmers. Perhaps because their life cycle involved an aquatic larval stage, the Q transmuted a large number of their human subjects into a bewildering array of aquatic creatures. Taken care of by specially bred attendants, these post-human came in every shape and size imaginable.
Stop!
Varieties of behemoths, water out of their hypertrophied mouths, and horrifying multitudes of brainless wallowers that served as food stock. Most of them were perfectly domesticated. All of them went extinct when their masters left. All save a few lightly mutated, generalized forms. These swimmers still resembled their human ancestors to a large degree. They had no artificial gills, their hands were still visible through their front flippers, their feet were splayed affairs that functioned like a pair of tail flukes. Recognizably human eyes peeked through their blubbery eyelids, and they spoke to each other, though not in words and never in sentient understanding. For millennia, they swam the oceans of their ecologically stunted world, feeding on diversifying kinds of fish and crustaceans, survivors of the food stock originally imported from Earth. With the intervention of the Q gone, natural selection resumed. The swimmers became more streamlined to better catch their fast prey. The prey responded by getting even faster, or evolving defensive countermeasures such as armor, spikes, or poison. Their evolution back on track, the swimmers drifted further and further away from their sentient ancestry. They would wait for a long time indeed to taste that blessing again. Lizard herders. They were the lucky ones. Instead of unrecognizably distorting them as they had done to most of their subjects, the Q had merely erased their sentience and stunted the development of their brains. Distantly resembling their
Hello.
ancient forebears on Earth, the primitives led feral lives for an unnaturally long time. They never regained sentience after the Q left, despite having every incentive to do so. This was partially due to the total absence of predators on their garden world, resulting in no advantage for intelligence. Furthermore, the Q had made some small but integral changes to their brains, tweaking with the structure of cerebellum so that certain features associated with heuristic learning could never emerge again. Once again, the reasons for these baffling changes remained known only to the Q. The dumb people eventually settled in a symbiosis with some of the other creatures that inhabited their planet. They began to instinctively farm some of the large herbivorous reptiles, ancestors of which were brought from Earth as pets. Soon the balance of this mutualism began to tip in the reptiles' favor. The tropical climate of the planet gave them an inherent advantage, and they underwent a spectacular radiation of different species. They encountered no competition from the only large mammals on the planet, the brain-neutered descendants of the starfarers. Faced with a reptilian turnover, the only adaptation the sub-men could muster was to slip quietly into bestial oblivion. Temptor. In the Temptor's case, the remodeling was done with an almost artistic enthusiasm. How they managed to survive in their bizarre form was not clear. Their ancestors were used as sessile decoration, and through some miracle of adaptation, they had endured. no human would have recognized them as their descendants. The females were beaked cones of flesh some 2 meters tall, rooted in soil like grotesque carnivorous plants. The males, on the other hand, resembled contorted bipedal monkeys. Unlike their mates, they were perfectly ambulatory. Dozens of them ran around the females' mounds like so many imps. Some would gather food, others would clean the females, while others would stand guard for danger. Although their actions looked purposeful, the males had no will of their own. In Temptor society, females controlled everything. Using a combination of vocal and pheromonal signals, they guided the masculine hordes into any number of menial tasks, while mating with the strongest, the most obedient, and the dumbest to produce even better drones. On certain periods, they would also give birth to a few precious females who would be carried away by subservient males to root themselves. It was a terribly efficient hegemony that would certainly give rise to civilization in a matter of centuries, had fate not intervened. As a stray comet obliterated the Temptor's mound forests, one of humanity's best chances for re-emergence was cruelly swept away. Bone Crusher. Through the deliberate modifications of Q and the blind molding of evolution, the heavens came to be populated with creatures that would put the myths of their ancestors to shame. Their ancestors were pint-sized pets of Q that were bred for the dazzling colours of their tooth-derived beaks. When their masters left, most of these pampered creatures died, with no one or nothing left to take care of them. But some, belonging to the hardiest breeds, survived. In less than a geological eye-blink of a few million years, the descendants of such creatures radiated into the evolutionary vacuum of their guarded world. One lineage led to a profusion of human herbivores. These were preyed upon by a variety of enamel-beaked raptors, each evolved to deal with a specific prey. Among these generalized niches were entire assemblages of specialized animals, resembling anything from ibis-billed swamp sifters to splendorous forms with bizarre crests that flared out of their toothy beaks. There were even secondarily sentient forms, in the shape of the ogre-like bone crushers. To an observer of today, they would indeed be the stuff of nightmares, 3 meters tall and hairy, sporting vicious thumb claws and enormous beaks that suited their scavenging diet. Despite their shortcomings, these corpse-eating primitives were one of the first species to attain intelligence and, although primitive, a level of civilization. All of this proved the fallacy of human prejudice in the post-human galaxy. A creature could feed on putrefying meat, stink like a grave, and express its affection by defecating on others, but it might as well be your own grandchild and the last hope of mankind. In eventuality, however, not even the bone crushers fulfilled this promise. Their dependency on carrion for food limited their population severely, and their medieval civilizations crumbled after a few uneventful millennia. Colonials. Their world had given the toughest resistance against the Q onslaught. So tough, in fact, they had turned back 2 successive waves of the invaders, only to succumb to the third. The Q, with their twisted sense of justice, wanted to make them pay. Even extinction would be too light a punishment for resisting the star gods. The humans of the rogue world needed a sentence that would remind them of their humiliation for generations to come. So they were made into disembodied conches of skin and muscle, connected by a skimpy network of the most basic nerves. They were employed as living filtering devices, subsisting on the waste products of Q civilization like massive cancer cells. Just to witness and suffer their wretched fate, their eyes, together with their consciousness, were retained. For 40 million years they suffered. Generation after generation were born into the most miserable of lives while absorbing the pain of all that they were going through. When the Q left, they hoped for a quick extinction. But their loneliness had also made them efficient survivors. Unchecked by the Q, the colonials spread across the planet in quilt-like fields of human flesh. After an eternity of tortured lives, the human fields tasted something that could almost be described as hope. Flyers. They were not uncommon at all in the domain of Q. At least a dozen worlds sported human-derived flying species of one kind or another. Most resembled the bats or the pterosaurs of the bygone past, dancing through the ether like angels, or demons, depending on the point of view. There were a few bizarre kinds relied on swollen gas glands for flotation as well. Sadly, most of these creatures were already too specialized to be anything but flyers. They had forsaken their humanity for the conquest of the sky. They had little potential for further radiation beyond their limited roles. The only exception proved out to be a monkey-like species that flew on wing membranes stretched across the last two fingers. Their advantage was a unique turbine-like heart, artificially developed during the regime of the Q. No other human flyer in the galaxy had such an adaptation. The starfish-shaped organs sat in the middle of their chests, directly funneling oxygen from the lungs to the bloodstream in a supremely efficient way. This meant that the flyers could develop energy-consuming adaptations, such as large brains, without having to give up their power of flight. Not that the flyers were going to reclaim their sentience right away. Instead, they literally exploded into skies, filling the heavens with everything from bomber-sized sailors to impossibly fast predators that raced with sound. Their world was pristine, and there were plenty of niches to play in. Intelligence could wait a little more. Hand flappers. Some flying post-humans reapproached sentience in an entirely different way. Without the augmented metabolisms or the gravitational advantages of their siblings on distant planets, they had no choice but to give up their power of flight in order to develop further. The hand flappers were one such species. Their wings, once used for butterfly-like flutters in the unearthly gardens of Q, had shrunken and reverted back into their manual condition. Their legs were likewise readapted, but they bore a splayed awkwardness from their perching ancestry. Only a singular and almost sadistically simple flaw held them back from developing civilization. In the course of their secondary atrophy, the wings of the hand flappers had become useless as hands as well. Their flag-like appendages were very useful in signaling and mating dances, but they couldn't hurl missiles, construct shelter, or even manufacture basic stone tools. All they could do with their useless hands was to display each other's sexual availability, so the hand flappers did just that, flashing and dancing their way to oblivion. Blind folk. When the Q came, they dug in and dug in deep. Inside several continent-sized shelters under the besieged world, they waited for the invaders to pass them by. It was a futile gamble. The Q located the shelter caves and remade their inhabitants without effort. The shelters became home to an entirely different ecology, a realm of perpetual darkness fueled by the trickle of water and nutrients from the world outside. A surprisingly complex ecology developed on this scant resource. Gigantic pale insects, the descendants of common household pests, competed with Dali-esque birds and rodents over fields of overgrown fungi. Predators were not uncommon. Almost crocodilian fish patrolled the underground streams and vast blind birds, echolocated with unnerving precision, keeping their toll on the residents of the cave floor. The kilometer-high ceilings of the shelters glowed in the dark with the protean constellations of bioluminescent fungi, and in some cases, animals. People were present here as well, albeit in unfamiliar forms. They were more often heard than seen, as they had tried to find their way in the dark with banshee-like screams. These albino troglodytes lived in a realm where sound and touch, not sight, was the gateway of perception. They had developed long tactile fingers, enormous whiskers, and mobile ears to live in the dark. Where their eyes should have seen, there was nothing but a patch of haunting, flawlessly smooth skin. Their perfect adaptation to the world of darkness had erased the most basic feature of human recognition. As adapted as they were They were doomed. Before the blind folk could develop any kind of intelligence to crawl out of their geographical graves, the glacial constriction of their world's continental plates snuffed out the shelters one by one. Lopsiders. The Q were grotesquely creative in their redesign of the human worlds. One group of misfortunate souls they transported to a planet with 36 times the amount of normal gravity and made them over for life in this bizarrely inhospitable realm. The results of these experiments resembled nightmare sketchings of Bosch, Dali, or Picasso. They looked like criminals squashed between sheets of glass. 3 out of their 4 limbs had become paddle-like organs for crawling. Only one of their arms remained as a spindly tool of manipulation. This singular, wizened limb also doubled as an extra sensor, like the antenna of an insect. Their faces were different horrors altogether. All pretensions of symmetry, the hallmark of terrestrial animals from jawless fish onwards, were completely and utterly done away with. One bulging eye stared directly upward, while the other scanned ahead, in the direction of the creature's vertically opening jaws. The ears were likewise distorted. Monstrous as they looked, these X-Men thrived in their heavy gravity environment. Once again, there was the usual explosion of species into every available niche, and the Lopsiders consolidated their chances for a renewed sentience. Striders. While the Lopsiders were redesigned to live under extreme gravity, another species had been adapted for life under the exact opposite conditions, on a Jovian moon with 1/5 Earth's gravity. It was a world of wonders, where even the grass grew almost 10 meters tall and the trees were almost beyond belief, towering to sizes attained only by the skyscrapers of antiquity. In these surreal forests lived equally spectacular fauna, the descendants of pets, pests, and livestock of humans, who in turn had been reduced to animosity as well. One could see them in the league-tall forests, almost dancing among the trees as they reared higher and higher to browse. Their arms, legs, and necks had been stretched impossibly thin. Great flaps of skin blossomed throughout their bodies to dispense waste heat. Sometimes they would even change their color in order to reflect light and keep cool. Overheating was a great problem for their grotesquely tall, thin bodies. Although imposing, these Geocometian wraiths were overdeveloped as to be sickeningly fragile. Even on their gravitationally a fall could shatter their bones, and slipping down from a branch would prove to be fatal. Sometimes on the open plains, even a strong wind could bring them down like the toppling masts. They survived entirely due to the merciful conditions of their garden world, which were about to change drastically. About 2 million years after the Q left their towering works of human art, a lineage of fearsome predators evolved from the terrestrial poultry that had gone feral on the planet. Resembling attenuated versions of their dinosaur ancestors, the predators swept through the garden world like wildfires, extinguishing any species too fragile to escape or resist. The peaceful, delicate striders were among the first to go. Parasites. Humanity had diverged into 2 separate lineages on their world. On one hand, there were several races of almost australopithecine cripples, degraded by the Q for managing to turn back their initial wave of invasion. Yet simple atavism was too light a punishment for them. Their twisted relatives, the parasites, made up the second part of their sentence. There were actually several kinds of parasitic ex-people, ranging from tortoise-sized ambulatory vampires to the more common fist-sized variety that lived attached to their hosts. There was even a tiny endoparasitic kind that infested the wombs of their female victims like ghastly, living abortions. All of these evolutionary tortures were played out under the careful scrutiny of the Q for 40 million years. The punishment was so baroque, so elaborate, that most of the artificial parasite-host relationships died out when the Q left. Some sub-men learned to cleanse their tick-like relatives by drowning, burning, or even eating them. Others, like the vaginal parasites, died out as their aggressive method of parasitism effectively sterilized their hosts. Yet one or two varieties did manage to cling onto their hosts with abdominal suckers, muscular gripping limbs, and sterile, pain-soothing saliva. But their success did not lie entirely in the strength of their parasitical advantages. They also learned to regulate their dumb hosts, not killing them by over-infestation and thus ensuring their own long-term survival as well. In any case, totally single-sided relations were rare in any ecology, natural or artificial. In millennial cycles, the cousin species' vicious parasitism began to give way to something more beneficial for both sides. Finger fishers. Their ancestors were trapped on an archipelago world, a planet sprinkled with many small continents and countless islands over interconnected networks of calm, swallow seas. Like a magnified Aegean, this place was a terrestrial paradise in many respects, except that after the Q, no minds were left to enjoy it. On this vacant biosphere, evolution was quick to begin her blind, unpredictable dance. Once feral, the descendants of degenerate humans adapted themselves to every available niche, no matter how exotic, how outlandish. They learned to pluck fish from the lazy shores. Millennia passed, and they settled more into their piscatorial lifestyle. Elongated fingers became ambulatory fish hooks, teeth modified for a generalized diet became needle-like affairs, lined up neatly in a long, thin muzzle. In less than a few million years, the fingerfishers established themselves as a prominent lineage. There was scarcely a beach, an island, or an estuary that was devoid of their pale, lanky forms. As prolific as they were, the fishers were still no better than animals. Their humanity would come only after another spasm of outlandish adaptions. Hedonists. Even the blissful existence of the fingerfishers would have seemed bothersome to the hedonists, for their kind was not evolved, but designed for a life of pleasure. The Q had kept them as pampered pets, set loose in a tropical island world of succulent fruits, bountiful trees, and calm, lapping lakes full of sweet, bacterial manna. Furthermore, the hedonists were left as the only animal life on this place. They had no choice but to enjoy it to the fullest. In normal conditions, any given species would quickly crowd out such a utopian environment. But normal conditions had never been the point of the Q redesign. They had altered their subjects so that they could conceive only after mating an enormous number of potential suitors continually over a period of decades. While this took care of the population problem, it also made the species less adaptable. Without any point in sexual competition, natural selection would progress only at a glacial pace. Fortunately, their stable microcosm remained free of environmental catastrophes even after the Q left. All these changes had also made the hedonists' day. Their lives were juxtaposed routines of browsing, sleeping, and mind-blowing sex, troubled neither by the concerns of disease or pregnancy. Aloof and carefree, they enjoyed the most pleasurable times of all mankind, albeit with the intellectual capabilities of 3-year-olds. It didn't really matter, though. Who needed to think when having such a nice time, after all? Insectophagi. Nondescript, quaint human species abounded in the post-Q galaxy. Hundreds of them lived out simple, unnoticed lives, never developing to become sentient, never learning their true heritage as stone-born human beings. Most of them went extinct, not to be missed or even remembered. Those that lingered on managed to survive in shady, quiet niches, never again making any impact on the celestial scheme of things. One such species was the Insectophagi. They had quietly adapted themselves for a diet of colonial insects and small animals. They had faces covered with leathery plates, claw-like hands to dig out prey, and worm-like tongues to scoop them up. All in all, they weren't special in any particular way, but a combination of galactic invasions, coincidence, and pure luck would make them the longest enduring of all starmen. The meek would inherit the cosmos, though not just yet. For now, the insect offergai were concerned only with the location of insect colonies and the onset of the mating season. Spacers. It must be remembered that the Star People did not succumb entirely to the Q invasions. While their worlds fell away one by one, some Star People took refuge in the void of space. One after another, entire communities scrambled into generation ships and cast themselves off into the darkness, hoping to go unnoticed by the beings that had overrun their galaxy. Desperate times made for desperate measures. As the Starmen had observed during their initial colonization of the galaxy, life in generation ships inevitably led to mass insanity and anarchy. This time, however, humans had to adapt themselves or face extinction. Entire asteroid fields were confiscated and hollowed out to make spaceships of unseen size. These hollow shells cradled bubbles of precious air and water, but no artificial gravity of any kind. It was discovered that a purely ethereal existence would ease the stress of interstellar exile, provided that its inhabitants were adapted for life inside such an environment. Furthermore, people were forced to change themselves. In an atmospherically sealed, gravity-free environment, their bones were left free to grow longer, thinner, spindlier. The circulatory and digestive systems were pressurized to avoid heart problems and congestion. The latter change had another advantageous side effect. Humans could navigate through the void with jets of air expelled from modified anuses. Such experiments were numerous and usually plagued with failure. Yet they did succeed in creating a future. Sealed tight in their moon-sized, air-filled, weightless havens, the descendants of the Star People managed to evade the scourge of the Q. It was an endless diaspora. Even after the Q left, they find themselves too divergent to have anything to do with their ancestral lifestyles. The survivors of the initial herd would never set foot on a planet again. Ruin haunters. A particular human species, singled out by its lucky access to the heritage of its stellar ancestors, would eventually come to play a leading role in the shape of things to come. They had gotten through the Q invasion with relatively little degradation. Yes, they had been reduced to the level of apes, but their recovery had been quick. Apparently, the Q had not worked as hard at suppressing their intelligence. Nor had they made a comparable effort to wipe away the material traces of the Starmen. Even after millions of years, enormous ruins of the global urban spaces littered the continents of their world. Thus did the ruin haunters earn their names. With developed minds and unrestricted access to the wisdom of the ancient cities, the exponential pace of their development was only natural. One by one, they deciphered and built upon the secrets of the bygone Star People until they almost equaled their galactic ancestors in wisdom and skill. All of this development happened in an unnaturally short period of time, and sometimes the oldest technologies were not even understood as they were blindly replicated. Needless to say, such a pace of development put premature stresses on the social and political structures of the ruin haunters. They barely survived the 5 consecutive world wars that raped their planet, 2 of which were thermonuclear exchanges. They made it through. Their baptism with fire had hardened and awakened them. The war united them politically and pushed their technological capabilities even beyond the level of the Star People. Coincidentally, they also developed a dangerous form of autochthonous madness. The ruin haunters had come to believe that they were the sole descendants and the true heirs of the Star People, and they were ready and willing to do anything in order to claim their fictitious and bygone golden age. Sentience reborn. If any sort of periodical arrangement can be brought to the history of mankind, the post-Q era of emerging human animals can be likened to a series of millennial dark ages. However, like any Dark Age situation, these periods of silence had finite lifespans. One by one, like stars emerging from the fog, new civilizations were born out of the shattered remnants of mankind. In some rare cases, the recovery was swift and straightforward. In most other situations, it came only after a lengthy series of adaptive radiations, extinctions, and secondary diversifications. Within these lines of descent, there was as much distance between the initial post-humans and their intelligent descendants as between the first Cretaceous fuzzballs and Homo sapiens. Sooner or later, human intelligence returned to the cosmos. But except for their shared ancestry, these new people had nothing in common with people of today, or even each other. Extinction. Not all human animals made it through. In fact, it must be realized that the majority of post-Q humans died out during the eras of transition. Extinction, the utter and absolute death of an entire family, entire community, entire species, was rampant in the galaxy. There was nothing cruel or dramatic in all of this. Extinction was as common and as natural as speciation. Sometimes a species simply failed to adapt to competition or the abrupt change of conditions. In other occasions, their numbers dwindled into imperceptible gulfs of time. This way or the other, human animals faded out. In all of this death, however, there was a new life. As one species vacated a certain niche, others would soon step in to take its place. Adaptive radiations would follow, filling in the blanks with myriads of diverse and varied forms. Despite the fallen, the flow of life would proceed, blazing in constant turnover. Snake people, descendants of the worms. The scorching sun eventually cooled down, and life flooded back to the surface from their subterranean stronghold. As animals of all kinds exploded into the terrestrial niches that had been left vacant for millennia, so did the descendants of the worms. On the surface, they found new opportunities as entire assemblages of serpentine grazers, swimmers, predators, and people. One form, descended from tree-climbing mammalian snakes, revolved the human intelligence that had lain dormant for so long. They observed, contemplated, and philosophized with novel, spirally coiled brains and handled the world with a singular pelvic hand, born out from the remnants of their ancestors' feet. They looked nothing at all like their distant human ancestors, but their social development followed a similar path. Several agricultural world empires, followed by industrial revolutions, social experiments, world wars, civil wars, and globalization. But then again, socio-political parallelism in history did not necessarily imply a similar or even recognizably human world. Modern cities of the global snake world were tangles of pipe-like roads, branching three-dimensional railroads, and windowless, whole-life buildings. Though their knotted architecture differed from region to region, these settlements generally looked like kilometer-wide balls of glass, metal, plastic, and cloth, wrapped so tightly that a human of today would find it impossible to move inside them. Plazas and open areas were totally absent, as they presented navigational obstacles and areas of insecurity. Their evolutionary background in the trees had made the snake people into borderline agrophobes. None of these, of course, was unusual to the snakes in any way. Their relatively alien lifestyle was as particular to them as ours is to us. All across their world, the arterial cities throbbed with people, living out lives as human as any other intelligent beings. Healer folk, descendants of the human predators. The animals also rebounded into civilization. Their journey involved a series of changes, during which they lost the adaptations that had allowed them to endure as the top predators of their world. The saber teeth, once used for slashing through sinew and trachea, became fragile and thin, useful only as organs of social display. The hook-like thumb claws were also reduced, but not deleted. In their place, the last two newfangled graspers. All this facility, however, did not mean weakness. Although they were no longer specialized in hunting, the killer folk could still kill with their bare hands, but only if they really wanted to. What enormous claws and teeth they could not do, they could easily achieve with a bow, arrow, flintlock, repeater, or gas rifle. Their descent from predators gave the killer folk a unique social profile. Almost all of their religions and rituals allowed for periods of completely natural, animalistic hunts and duels. This necessity of venting these atavistic urges also led to the formation of religious hunter nobilities, privileged warriors who were skilled in the arts of hunting, war, and murder. Entire societies were assembled underneath these ruling classes, orderly communities that erupted once every year into an orgy of death, sex, and prey. For thousands of years, nomadic warriors, together with their vast herds of once-human livestock, chased and battled each other across a chessboard of continents. All of this chaos was to be swept apart with the advent of modernity. In a development comparable to an industrial revolution, one nation pack of killers devised methods of settled, intensive factory farming. Organized state structure, secularism, and technological leapfrogging were quickly followed. Needless to say, such developments polarized the world into bands of progressive, developed factory herders and increasingly fanatical hunting states. While one side condemned their old animal ways, the other side embraced them with blind zealotry. This was their crisis of modernity, the balkanization of the progressive and conservative factions on the road to global unity. Fortunately, the killers managed to pull themselves through, even after drifting dangerously close to global conflict at certain points. Tool breeders, descendants of the swimmers. They used to be simple creatures, descendants of a battered people that had taken to the sea. Their remote sapiens ancestors would have given such beings no chance of a sentient comeback, for they thought that technological advances were impossible in the fluid medium of the oceans. But the swimmers disproved such predictions by founding one of the most advanced and most outrageously alien cultures in the entire human lineage. Fire, the cornerstone of industrial engineering, was almost impossible to sustain and use underwater. But the breeders simply chose another path when complex tool-making proved impractical. They began to breed their tools and machines for them. It had started long before the species was even intelligent. In the endless variety of life in the seas, the swimmers always adopted and controlled the organisms that were useful in some way. Once domesticated, these creatures were willingly or unintentionally modified through artificial selection and conditioning. The process was slow, but once underway, its effects were formidable. The modern city of the breeders was a sight to behold. Huge, heart-like creatures pumped out nutritious fluids to a network of self-repairing, living conduits. This was their equivalent of a power grid, and it reached every single one of the breeders' huge exoskeletal dwellings, powering bioluminescent lights, flickering cephalopods, skin televisions, medicinal sea squirts, and countless other devices that have been bred from living creatures. The advances in biology had risen exponentially until genetic engineering was completely mastered. Modern breeders did not even need to use animals. A simple manipulation of cultured tissues and stem cells could give solutions to any problem at hand. The mastery of genetics had conquered many obstacles. The yawning ocean depths, as well as the planet's few tiny land masses, were now firmly within the breeders' grasp. However, they were not content with mere planetary dreams. New forms and bizarre creatures were still being developed in daring attempts to conquer the one realm that was most hostile to life. Sealed in their living ships, the breeders wished to return to the stars. Sauro sapiens, livestock of the lizard herders. One of humanity's eventual inheritors was not even human. They came from the reptilian stock that had proliferated during the demise of the lizard herders. Theirs was a true case of a world turned upside down, as the humans degenerated into witless animals